Well, welcome to this. Oh, I'm hearing
myself again, David. We had some technical difficulties which were a couple of minutes
late. Oops. So while we're trying to get the technical stuff sorted out, if you want to put in the comments on Facebook or on YouTube where you're listening from. So, David, do you want to plug those into the computer and see if that works?
Any better now?
We getting any feedback? No, that sounds good. Then you can hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
That's good. Good.
I can also hear myself, which is awful, but never mind.
Well, it's great that you're able to join us for this Facebook Live, whether you're joining us live or recorded, and also being broadcast on YouTube. And I'm really pleased to be joined by David McCarthy and Lesley Hamilton-Messer. Do you want to introduce yourselves? We're going to be talking about this book, Seeing Afresh, written by David, and talking about what's happened in the Church of Scotland and looking at fresh expressions from that context. But just want to introduce yourselves. David, do you want to go first, and then Lesley?
Yeah, well, until relatively recently, I was the Church of Scotland development worker for Fresh Expressions of Church, just retired from that job. And prior to that, I'd been involved in developing new forms of church in Scotland and in overseas in Spain, as well as doing a few other things. In terms of the book, it really was in collaboration with Lesley, so I wouldn't want to take sort of credit for it full stop, although it's my name that's on the cover.
Great. And Lesley, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I still work for the Church of Scotland. I work for the what's the Faith Nurture Forum in the Church of Scotland in their central offices, and it's one of the departments that provides support to regional and local churches, to those structures. So I am the Church Without Walls team leader and worked with David in a number of years on mission and fresh expressions and emerging church.
Brilliant. And just to complete the list, as it were, my name's Simon Goddard. I'm part of the National Fresh Expressions team, leading in resourcing, and as a colleague with David on the Partners Hub, where various denominations, mission leaders came together. Sort of the Fresh Expressions leads came together, and I was a Baptist rep, and David was there on behalf of the Church of Scotland. So it's good to reconnect with you, David, in this format.
Likewise, Simon.
It's good. So first of all, it'd be really good if the pair of you could tell us sort of where did the book come from? Why write Seeing Afresh, and what was sort of the background to the book being written, and perhaps some of the process of it being written.
Yeah. Lesley, I'm just wondering if you want to give the background and I could then give the process. How does that sound? Given we had, looking at things earlier.
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations. I think one of the things that occurred to us is that the stories we were hearing and what we were seeing was changing quite rapidly, and that actually if we didn't sort of capture some of that, then some of that wisdom would be lost, and actually how you react to things at the time and how you remember reacting at a few years distance can be quite different. So we wanted to capture something of where we were, not because it was anywhere near the finished article, but a sense of actually, well, what was the starting points for some people? What were the initial things they encountered? And something of the range of different places that people were at. So it really was a snapshot in time.
Yeah, and in terms of the process, really picking that up, it was important for us to record not just statistical numbers, but to really develop our account in a relational way. So we interviewed over a period of about 9 months, 8 particular either fresh expressions or potential fresh expressions of church, which show the diversity within Scotland, from urban areas, from those that were approaching a priority status, to the Highlands, to the islands, to an online church, really a wide variety. And then as we interviewed them, we asked some basic questions, which we might come to later. So that formed quite a core section of the book. And again, although it related to specifics in our Scottish context, the things that were coming up really related across the board, we felt, to the UK. So the resource we were developing, was of importance, not just us in Scotland, but we felt further afield. Then, as Lesley said, we picked up in the second part of the book wider lessons that we had learned as individuals, but also as a denomination, things which were core for others to consider as they began to think about pioneering or develop their own pioneering. And we also wanted the book to not be glib or superficial to paint an artificial picture, but to be one that would encourage and help people take first steps or next step.
Yeah. So my hope is that the conversation that we have, which will pick up some of the themes of the book and hopefully give people a taste for the book, which will let you know where you can order it from if you did want to buy a copy of the book later. So what I'm guessing is that the things that we'll talk about, although they are lessons from the Scottish context, are lessons that can be applied and be beneficial to wherever people are watching from.
Yeah.
Yeah. So someone said that the Facebook live wasn't working. Well, I might have a look at that in a moment. But thank you for joining us, Duncan, and for Carol, who is in the Leicester Diocese for Arnold. So got a number of people watching. If you want to let us know in the comments, if you're watching on Facebook, which I think Carol is, then it'd be good to reassure us that that's still working okay. But let's begin with the first question. And so there's three questions in a sense about what lessons have been learned. And the first question that is one of the chapters in the book is, what have we learned about God? And it'd be good to hear from both of you some of the things that you sort of came into answering that question when you sort of were writing that chapter and what you were hearing.
Yeah, could I come in just before we look at the specifics there, Simon, to say why we asked those three specific questions as our first question. We asked folks what they'd learned about God, about themselves, about their community. And we felt it was really important to ask those questions first, rather than more functional ones, what has been happening, what has worked, what hasn't worked, what advice would you give? Because at the core of church are relationships. Therefore, at the core of trying to understand what's happening in a fresh expression of church is relationships as well. And from that, we begin to develop and look at the more functional questions. So that's actually why, although we didn't ignore the practical, what's happening on the ground, we felt it was really core and theologically correct as well to go back to those basic questions of relationship.
Brilliant. So we've got those three questions, and let's tackle them in turn. So the first question: what have we learned about God? What were people saying as you asked them that particular question?
Well, can I kick off with two basic ideas, and I'll let Lesley show where I am in total error. For me, there were a few things that really stood out across the board, and the first was that people had learned so much about the love of God, not just in an abstract way, but allowing themselves to be captivated by the love of God. And as they were captivated by the love of God, they found that they couldn't help but love others. Now, that comes into something further down the road we might look at, but that was core. And I think of Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides, and going into the shed, a wonderful example there. And a man who was probably maybe of similar vintage to myself, because he quoted a Black Sabbath song. He said he was overwhelmed by love when he came to this place. Prior to entering it, the Black Sabbath song, "Killing Yourself to Live," had been the theme of his life. But now that was totally turned round by this sense of love and acceptance and being loved. Second thing that came across clearly from nearly all of the groups was that God is everywhere. And again, we can pick this up on discipleship, but we're not bringing Jesus to places where he is not as we engage in fresh expressions of church. So those were two key things.
Brilliant. Lesley, anything to add to the lessons about God?
Yeah, no, I would agree completely with that. And I think one of the other things that came out was the creativity of God, God's creative nature, and actually, that not only is God everywhere, but God's doing all sorts of. There's not much there's nothing we could imagine that God is not already ahead of us. So the creativity of God, and the kind of the permission that gave to be creative and to do things differently, and secondly, also just the fact that, again, I think people were captivated by that, and there was a real joy in finding that God was at work in different ways and amongst different people than perhaps we would have expected, and that was a real sense of joy and encouragement in that.
Yeah, it does relieve the pressure if you're feeling that you're joining in with God in something that he's already doing, rather than being responsible for starting something that to know God's already there, and you just need to notice that's a real it gives freedom, doesn't it, to just find enjoy in that process.
I mean, if you're into science fiction and fantasy, as Lesley and I are, the sense of quest and adventure and exploration, I mean, it's as you say, it's liberating. It gives you life. It gives you energy. And you think, oh, this is brilliant. Why would you do anything else?
Brilliant. So let's move on to the second question, which is what people were learning about themselves as they engaged in fresh expressions of church and were joining in with the mission of God. What were people learning about themselves? And Lesley, do you want to go first with this one?
I think one of the things that people learned was maybe that God believed in them. And none of us are perfect and none of us are flawless. And there was a sense that actually all of those experiences of life, all the things we're really proud of, all the things that we wish we perhaps had done differently, all of those experiences shape who we were and who we are, and that God takes all of that and is able to use that, and actually through God, all of those experiences can connect with people, can connect with God's mission. They make us who we are. So there was a sense of not having to be other than who we were in order to come to God. So that authenticity and that integrity with the whole of life, that we didn't have to come with a carefully edited version of ourselves in order to be part of God's mission.
Yeah. David, anything to?
I mean, again, think there were 3 or 4 things that came across for me consistently as we chatted to folks in these different groups from different contexts. One was the actual need to be radically honest about motivation, because picking up the theme of love, that has got to be the core motivation. Now, there are certain things that may shake us up in terms of finances, falling numbers, all the normal things that many churches are facing, but they cannot be the motivation for mission and engaging in developing new forms of community centered around Jesus. I mean, if they do, or if they do form our motivation, rightly we should fail, or else allow God to put us back on course. It's got to be this belly of fire of love. The second thing, which came up in one group in particular, was highlighting something that Tom Wright had said about Acts 1, where the disciples say to Jesus, in a sense, when will the end come? When's it all going to come to fulfillment? And Jesus says, that's the Father's authority to decide, but you are given power to be my witnesses. And the point Tom Wright makes, and this group in particular had picked up, was that so often we want the authority of God. We want to run the schedule, develop the strategy in detail, be the ones in control. And God says, no, but actually, I'm going to give you the power as you are obedient. And interestingly, so often we believe that we don't have that power of God's Spirit. So we're wanting something that is God's, and we're not accepting something that God has given us. And that, I think, was a really interesting insight, because it's true across the board as we engage in often so many forms of mission. The other, I suppose, very quickly, couple of things were we need to embrace what we're about now, and really embrace that we're wanting to develop a new shape of community centered around Jesus. To give the classic example of messy church, some will embrace what it is, i.e., it's going to be a new form of church community which will develop its own way of being church. But others within the church will say, well, actually, it's a route into Sunday morning, our Sunday school, our family services. And when they see a messy church developing well midweek, they'll say, but we're not seeing anybody on Sunday morning. And of course you won't. That's why we're starting it on a Wednesday or a Thursday. And I think there's got to be an honest conversation and an honest carrying through of what we are instigating when we're developing this process. There's lots of things, but one other thing which was really important is that succession of leadership needs to be worked through intentionally and well. So you could have someone from an inherited model of church and a fresh expression model of church, and the initial leaders get on really well. But when it moves to second generation of leadership in either context, unless that is intentionally worked through and the vision is shared, you potentially have significant problems.
Yeah. There's so much there in what you've both shared about what we learn about ourselves. The whole, and it sort of goes back to what we learned about God, that the one that he's the one that's engaging in his mission, and we can't be in control. We need to relinquish control. God's the one that has that. And I'm just thinking in terms of where we start. We can't start with church. You can't start with, or we need more people on a Sunday morning. We can't start with, we're in decline. We need to be worrying about that. We need to start, like you said, in that place of love, that place of a heart for mission, a heart for God and God's work in the world. And that's where the adventure comes in. But also, that can sometimes be scary when those things are looming large around us. In churches where we struggle to see a younger generation coming through, and that can sometimes overwhelm, and can be well-meaning in certain terms of, we're wanting to engage in order for this church to continue. But it sounds like there's that can't be the primary motivation for what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sorry, Simon. I'm getting a bit of feedback on myself, so apologies if I'm cutting across.
No, that's fine.
There's something else which relates to this, and it's accepting the steps in this adventure, which at times it's absolutely wonderful, and at times it is really threatening, not just scary. So one of the things we looked at was, how do we understand risk? What is an appropriate risk? What is an inappropriate risk? And one of the examples that we gave was like 40 years ago when I was working on the Shankill Road in Belfast, and it was really quite at the heart of the Troubles. And the Shankill Road is an area where there's a peace line. And at that stage, you would have people from one community, or terrorists from one community, going into any street in the other community and randomly shooting someone, because they knew what chances are they are from the other community. Okay, so I was working in a church. Now, I kind of love walking, going for a walk in the evening, but it would have been absolutely foolish to have walked down some of those streets 10 o'clock at night because of what was happening. So that would have been a foolish risk. But on the other hand, my call from God was to pastor a community. So if I got a call that somebody needed pastoral care at 10 o'clock at night, I would walk down that street. So it's the same action, but one was an inappropriate risk. The other was an appropriate risk. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a bit, a relevant question here. What is God calling us to do? It's not bravado. It's not trying to shake the system or make a name for ourselves. It's doing what it means to follow Christ.
Yeah.
And I think that distinction of risk is quite important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that comes out is related to the motivation is really the values that underpin what we're doing. And quite often, even those who like to think of ourselves as time to time at the cutting edge of whatever, actually things become habitual and normalized very quickly. And so actually, as David said, the behaviours and the actions and the things that we're involved in might change, but the values will remain constant. And when they're rooted in our theology, when they're rooted in the love of Christ and the mission of God, then actually when it comes to hard decisions about, this has served us for a season, it's time to move on, it's time to let go, we can hold things lightly if we're if we're returning to the values, and that's what we're passing on to the next generation or the successive leadership. When we become too wedded to specific practices and specific forms of things, then actually they can start to become an obstacle in themselves. So when things are going really well and there's plenty of money and resort and you're getting loads of good feedback and stuff, it might not seem to make much difference, but actually when things start to get tight, like during for example a global pandemic or in anything else that might come our way, and sometimes hard decisions have to be made, it's our values and our motivations that will actually shape how we go forward.
And I think that go on, David.
So I'm just going to pick up, because I mean that's so important what Lesley has said there, that and again it came across in our conversations with folks, one, that we were understanding church in terms of core relationships that we have through Jesus with God, Father, Son, and Spirit, with one another in a local community centered around Jesus, with our wider community and world and mission, and the Church Universal. And therefore, the values we were putting across were that those were core, therefore practices must enhance those relationships, and we must evaluate their capacity in doing that. And the other thing that we worked through with folks was that this wasn't just a fad or a fashion or something that works in terms of this approach. It was, as Lesley used the term, theology that was profoundly based on our theology, our understanding of Trinity, incarnation, kingdom of God, and the wildness of God.
Yeah. And as you're both talking, and we'll move on to what we're learning about community in a moment, but as you're both talking, I was thinking about how we understand some of the words we use in church, like faithfulness. And I've encountered churches who use that word. At least we're being faithful, and what they mean is we're doing what we've always done. Their faithfulness is to the activity of the church rather than, in a sense, to what God is calling them into in this season. We're always called to be obedient to the call of God. We're not always called to carry on doing what the previous generation did in terms of, and it's sometimes just understanding what we mean when we say words like being faithful, because some people will understand that in whatever God's calling us into, whether that's new and different or challenging or risky, we need to be obedient to it. Others will say, well, no, that's, we need to keep doing things the same because that's what being faithful means. So let's move on to the question about, and we've already touched on that a bit, but what people were learning about their communities. You got thoughts on that?
Okay. I mean, that turned up lots of really interesting things for us. Let me just mention a few, and do cut my mic if I go on too long here, Simon. Okay, really, or rather than my throat. The first was that community will shape and should shape the form of church, and that's based on our theology of incarnation. So we're not pretending here or using nice phrases. Now, that can be more difficult at times than we might assume, but we've got to have integrity there. Secondly, as we look at a community or context, and this has certainly been my experience both in Scotland and in Spain, we need to look at how does this community reflect or resonate the values of the kingdom of God. So there will be things which we will affirm and allow us to develop really constructive partnerships. And there will be things that at the appropriate time, we will need in turn to challenge. Also linked to that, and maybe this is a strange question, but we need to ask, what does this community need to hear about the gospel? Almost as the first thing, our way in. Now, obviously, we want them to know the wholeness of God's grace, but what is paining and painful in this community? So, like, I know one group I was working with, fear was a real scar on the community. Therefore, in terms of the good news of Jesus, that was obviously something that we would address as one of the first issues with which we engaged. I would say that as we look at our community, we also need to look, how is the global, wider influences in society affecting this community? And how are they affecting them in a particular way that might be different from another community? But the big global influences over which folks have no immediate control will be affecting them. And very briefly, a few other things. One was the importance of seeing and valuing the other for who they were. And this, again, goes back to loving and developing relationships. I mean, Rowan Williams, I think it's the Faith in the Public Square in that book, has a lovely example. Well, it's either that or Words on the Edge, one of his two books. Anyway, where he talks about prison guards and the advantage of putting people into solitary confinement or not allowing them to see family. Because once they witness them being loved by someone, suddenly this prisoner wasn't something abstract. He became a person, or she became a person, someone who was loved. And when the other is seen as someone who is loved, not just generic part of humanity, then that makes a big difference. So the great thing about God, he loves humanity, but he loves us as individuals. Yeah. And the very final thing was, we were finding that we need to foster curiosity and an honest openness in our relationship with the community. Yeah.
Brilliant. I don't know whether Lesley, David's left you anything to say on that. That was really rich. That was really rich, David. Thank you for what you shared there.
Yeah, David will testify I'm rarely short of words. Meaning maybe, but Probably not. I think some of the things that stuck out for me, I mean, some of the things that seem obvious, and we've been reading about them in books and listening to it for years, but when people discover for themselves that actually God's already ahead of us and out there and doing things, and that people are having experiences, spiritual experiences, but without having had any contact with the church, and the thought of God actually having the nerve to be out there and doing stuff without having cleared it with our leadership team first, is actually, when you experience that for the first time, that's a big moment for individuals and teams. I think the other thing is realising, David said, that even where people have a very strong sense of community, people don't like to be treated as part of a job lot. People are individuals, people value their uniqueness, and actually they want to be seen as individual human beings and loved and cared for who they are. So actually, when we treat the community as part of a marketing exercise or a target audience or a whatever, actually that comes across. People know that actually, well, you know what, you're not really interested in me, and people get that. Conversely, when we deeply seek to engage with and to love and to serve, people get that as well, and you can't fake it. And I think the other thing is, it says people aren't interested in a church whose ambition is to save itself. People are interested in a church that will expend itself to save the world. Through the mission of Jesus Christ, and you don't need even to think of church. If you listen to the political parties all through Brexit and IndyRef and dear knows what else, when you constantly hear politicians saying we need someone who'll be good for the party, we need someone who'll bring the party together, and you're sitting there going, well, what about the country? What about the people? I want someone that will do something for us. It's no different when people look at church, and when all of our internal debates are on how to save ourselves. Why would people engage? So actually realizing that, until we're willing to give ourselves away for the sake of the mission of God, people aren't that interested.
I think Jesus said some things about that, didn't he? In terms of, if a man seeks to save his life, but to lose it, you find it. And unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But when it does die, it produces a harvest 30, 60, 100-fold. In that sense, I know the Mission Shaped Church report, they almost called it dying to live, and that sense of giving ourselves away. Actually, in that process, we find life. We have a gospel that is focused around resurrection, death and resurrection, and one comes the other side of the other. New life comes the other side of death. We need to die to something in order to find that new life, and it's very powerful. Also, it was interesting, Lesley, what you said about individuals. You said it in terms of what we learn about ourselves, that God's interested in every aspect of our life as a member of the church and as someone seeking to engage in the mission of God. My hobbies, my interests, that the whole person, God's interested in that. But that's also true for the community, that we need to look beyond and identify someone as an individual in every aspect of their life, not just where they live, but every aspect. I'm just going to so at this point I just want to make it clear that you where you can get hold of the book. So the FX Resourcing website shop, it's available there. I'm just going to put a link in the chat box as well, in the comments here. You can also buy it direct from St Andrew's Press. And you can see that link there. So, and just as I'm just taking a break before we move on to the next set of questions, if you are watching and want to ask a question, we want to, as we sort of move into the second half hour of this, to make it more of a conversation with those of you that are watching as well. So do feel free to ask questions, either about what people found specifically in Scotland or something. I mean, hopefully you're hearing that what has been found out in the across the fresh expressions in the Church of Scotland are relevant to where you are as well. So do ask questions in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. So let's move on to that second part of the book, and there were sort of some themes, some practical themes. Having asked those three particular questions, but some practical themes that came out, and the first one about sharing a vision. How this is the second question is about getting started, but this is sort of the before you start a fresh expression. How do you cast a vision for starting something new, engaging in a new way with your community? And so maybe Lesley, I don't know if you want to take that one first, or
people have approached this in kind of different ways, but I think there is a willingness to there has to be a willingness to hear what God is saying to us now for this time. And when we're thinking of fresh expressions, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw everything out and everything's new. As someone said, milk's not a new idea, but you do want it fresh every day. And so that sense of waiting on God, and the real sort of triple listening to the community, listening to God, listening to the wider church and what's happening, and being able to kind of hold and discern those things together, and a sense of what is it that God's calling us to at this time in this place. It's contextual, and it's not what the vision was when our church was founded 200 years ago, and it's not a kind of nostalgia trip, but actually what is it that God's want to do. So that something about waiting on God, being prepared to listen, sometimes hearing the quieter voices, and sometimes having the patience to wait until other people have caught that vision too. The being able to share that, understanding who sometimes the key people are that actually you want to take on that journey as well, and having the patience to wait for them also to hear, and to to get confirmation of that vision through those kind of processes. But I think that's the first one, and just having eyes to see really what's right in front of us is a good starting point.
Yeah. David, anything to add to that?
Yes, I would really take what Lesley has said, and this waiting on God as part of the listening across the board, and sometimes waiting on God to allow him to help us remember who we are, whose we are, and what the adventure is. Now, let me be geekish here for a moment and go back to Star Trek. And for those who aren't Star Trek fans, it happens in a universe over different time scales. And the original Mr. Spock, Captain Kirk, was at one period. And then they had generations which took place 70 years later. Now, in one of the films, they brought Captain Kirk and Captain Picard together from the two different generations. And in the plot, Kirk has found himself from his time in a timeless zone, which is comfortable, where whatever you want is yours. You can live at ease in a world which is actually fantasy, but it seems real, and you are living it out. Meanwhile, in his time zone, Picard needs to rescue a planet. And the only one who can help him do this is obviously Kirk. So he travels to this world called the Nexus, and he challenges Kirk. He says this. He says, remember who you are. You're a starship captain. Come back with me. And at that point, Kirk realizes, this world that he is in isn't the real world. So he goes back with Picard. They rescue the planet, but in the process, Kirk is mortally wounded. And as he's lying dying, Picard comes over, and Kirk asks him this question. Did we do it? Did we make a difference? And Picard says, yes, we made a difference. And when I watched that, I thought, that's it. God calls us from any fantasy or world of a false ease that we would create for ourselves. He calls us back to who we are to make a difference. And then at that point, when in one sense we close our eyes and open our eyes for the first time and we see Christ face to face, we can say, did we do it? Did we make a difference? And Christ says, well done, good and faithful servants. Yes, we did it. We made a difference. And I think, that waiting and listening is part of it. Part of it is to allow us to begin to become, who we are. We face our fears. We face the false realities we would make, and those dark things within ourselves. And then we go on together. And the second thing, which I think I've talked about, maybe Lesley could talk about, was how, in the particular way we began to share this through Going for Growth, both, the local, the Presbytery, and the national.
There's an invitation for you, Lesley.
Yeah, yeah, we did. I mean, we got. We were asked the way our sort of polity works is the General Assembly, the big annual shindig that we have makes a lot of our decisions and sets the agenda for our work to come. And some of that we know going into it, and other things are a complete surprise to us in the week. And one of the things that was accepted was go out and basically train people and get new, fresh expressions and stuff. And we thought, this isn't something that can come from the centre. This has to be something that's absolutely embedded in the context and the local. How do we, working for the central departments, actually enable this? So we kind of hit the road, and we invited people to have conversations, essentially. And we did two things, three things, saying that this actually feels like a call from God to ask us all to explore in our context what the possibilities are for what God might be calling us to do, as an entire denomination, but has to be embedded contextually. So we want to invite you to that conversation. We also want to make it absolutely clear that you have permission to engage in those radical thoughts and radical conversations. That this is something that you know. It isn't cutting across where the church is at. This is actually where the denomination is inviting you to step into. So you have permission to think creative thoughts. You have permission to engage with people you haven't up until now. You have all that permission. Let's make that really clear. And then we started to facilitate some of the conversations at local level and say, well, what are you seeing? What is actually out there? What are you encountering? What is it that is tugging on your heart and keeps you awake at night? What are the questions that are waking you up in the morning? These could all be pointers as to where God's calling you, and let's embed this locally. So we did that over a period of about 3.5, 4 years. We did that right across. We invited every part of the Church of Scotland to be, and anyone else who wanted to join in. But because some of those conversations were specifically about how the Church of Scotland is structured, so we invited those conversations, and then we invited folk who had been there to think about Afresh Expressions Vision Day. And I think in just about every case, maybe one, and that was more timing than anything, that was followed up with Fresh Expressions Vision Days. Following that, we had, for 3 years in a row, we had a residential summer school, and we invited people there not just to increase the amount of information they had in their heads, but also start to form networks and to be able to share and to take that back to their communities and think about how they would embed that, how they would share the vision locally and move forward. So it was quite a practical process, and tried to model something that we were doing that folks in their local context could then take and model as a way of sharing the vision within their local setting.
Brilliant. I just want to share with you something that's just been put in the comment box. Out of those going for growth conversations, Irvine and Kilmarnock Presbyteries recruited 6 mission pioneers to facilitate different missional projects. Fantastic. That's encouraging, isn't it, when you talk about that process and they're an actual example of what's happened as a result of that, which is great.
And that's been, can you say that particular presbytery, Irvine and Kilmarnock Presbytery, they're not just ones who are kind of intellectually assenting to people going out and doing things. They have recalibrated the way they do those regional structures of church, not just to permit, but to facilitate and enable pioneering to happen.
Yeah.
And I was just reflecting at the weekend, someone was talking about Martin Luther King, and he said the biggest obstacle wasn't the haters, if you like, to the civil rights movement. It wasn't the Ku Klux Klan and the radical white supremacists. It was the moderate whites who were sympathetic, but ultimately wouldn't come out of their comfort zone enough to actually change things. And so it's quite often that we're with you. You can do it if you want, but it's nothing really to do with us, and we don't need to move. That's actually one of our regional structures that has radically looked at the way they do things to enable this.
That's great. And we think about the missing generation in our churches, and I hear comments from people saying about younger people, millennials, they don't want to commit to the life of the church. And I think one of the challenges is that we haven't raised the bar enough. There isn't enough meaning and purpose for their engagement in the church for them to want to engage. Actually, when there is a sense of excitement, of adventure, of changing the world together, actually that it's when we raise the bar of that commitment, I think there's a sense in which a younger demographic wants to connect. They don't want to keep things going. They do want to be involved in engaging in something with purpose.
They don't want to save the church. They want to be
part of
the church that saves the world.
Indeed.
Yeah. Simon, can I just mention one thing, which is, I suppose, not at a tangent, but a parallel thing that came up in sharing a vision. I mean, one of the, I suppose, reservations or questions that often folks from, I suppose, the more established denominations had was the idea of accountability and how this idea of mixed ecology, how an inherited expression and a fresh expression of church might relate together. And through a man called Peter Nielsen, who is an absolute hero of mine in the Church of Scotland, he developed this model of what he called an archipelago model. Now, a pattern of islands. Let me sort of explain, and Lesley, you can pick up where I'm amiss on this one. But say, for instance, when we were at the summer school, if we had somebody from Orkney, which is a series of islands, and we were asking people where they were from, somebody might say, oh, I'm from Kilmarnock, or I'm from Glasgow, I'm from Perth, I'm from Orkney. Perfect sense. But if we were up in Orkney doing part of our Going for Growth or a Vision Day, and you said to somebody, where are you from? They wouldn't say, I'm from Orkney. That's, even though I'm Irish, I mean, I can guess that. They would say, well, I'm from Hoy, or I'm from Westray, or Papa Westray, or Sandy, or wherever, one of the islands. Now, you see, interestingly, in saying that, they weren't, denying their identity as being from Orkney, or the governance that came from the council as part of being from Orkney. But they were saying, I'm from a particular island. Now, interestingly, islands have their own distinctiveness, sometimes cultural, the geology, the history, the fauna, the flora, whatever. And there's lots of very purposeful interconnections between these islands. And it isn't just that the biggest island is the center of the spoke. They crisscross. And those from the bigger island will often go to a smaller island for something that isn't on the bigger island. And, you have ferries going across, you have people being brought from one to another. Now, I think that was a great model for looking at a mixed ecology. Because if you were to drain the water, you've actually got one landmass that appears a series of islands. But in this pattern of islands, in our parish, if that's your particular system. You can have a common identity, a common governance, a common accountability, and yet a rich and radical diversity, which, just like at the Council of Jerusalem, where the Gentile and the Hebrew church really and truly appreciated and encouraged one another. So there is no reason, we were finding as we share a vision, why a mixed ecology couldn't work and shouldn't work, even if in reality sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. And what you're saying sounds a bit using people. Sometimes people talk about mother-daughter church plants. It sounds like what you're talking about is, the various aspects of church life, fresh expressions, the more inherited congregations that perhaps relate together as sister congregations, sister expressions, rather than in that way.
Yes, that's right. More like siblings.
Siblings, yeah.
I think it's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah.
It's interesting. So the archipelago with the islands being part of the Scottish identity. It
was an easy model for us. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, we're almost at the hour. We've got about 5 minutes left, and maybe this is about whetting people's appetite to go and buy the book to hear about getting started, discipleship, and parish life. And maybe you've touched on parish life a bit there, David, but it just sort of opportunity to sort of round up this conversation. If there are any questions, now's the time to type them in the comments on Facebook or on YouTube. But we're not going to get through each of those areas, getting started, discipleship, or parish life. But any sort of final thoughts as we come into sort of the last 5 minutes of this?
Okay, two very quick, because it's appropriate I give Lesley the last word. One is discipleship. People often balk at this because if you look at often the traditional set of circles within your fresh expression process, discipleship is somewhere along the line. I think we've got to understand discipleship as intrinsic from the beginning. For if we are Christ, the Spirit of God will spill out from within us. So right from our early listening and engaging, there is a form of shaping and discipling going on, which will become more explicit and intentional, or may well. So I think discipleship is not something to balk at, although often groups do feel this is a big hurdle. And we do deal quite a bit with that in the book, because that's an important issue. My final thing is, I think I'd mentioned I worked in Spain, and there was a lovely old Spanish phrase, which isn't used any longer, I think. But it was, the way we would say goodbye, which is kind of a shortcut for saying, God be with you. The old Spanish phrase was vaya con Dios, which doesn't mean God be with you, but may you go with God. And I think that's at the heart of what we've been talking about over the past hour.
Brilliant, David. So Lesley, it seems you've been given the last word. Any further thoughts on those areas we didn't get to cover?
No, I think the time to listen is never over. It's not like you listen and then you stop listening and then you go and do something. It's that's there. Right through that constant listening and reorientating ourselves to Christ on a regular basis and making sure that we're still there. And again, the discipleship thing, we still have this thing. That's something that happens once you're in the church. Always remember that at Caesarea Philippi, the disciples had been with Jesus about 18 months before any of them made a declaration of faith. So he had been discipling people from the get-go. And so I think what David said is right. There was an author, Brad Kallenberg, who talks about sort of evangelism by immersion, that being by inviting people in and sharing community with them. There are things that can actually, about the Christian life, that can only be understood as you live them. And so actually that kind of integrity with what we proclaim, with how we live, and inviting people in to share that and be part of it is a really powerful thing. And yeah, that's it really.
Brilliant. Well, I just want to thank you both again for your time this afternoon. I just want to put up this comment. I don't know if you've seen this. Carol, who's in Leicester Diocese, said she could have listened to David and Lesley for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you for your time. So I don't know whether that's something to do with the accents or probably more to,
in our
more
context,
to do with what you were saying.
Yeah, nobody has ever said that to us before.
So it's brilliant to have had the conversation with you this afternoon, and it's a great book, and as I say, the learning, although it's come out of the Church of Scotland, I think is relevant for all those engaging in fresh expressions, and really useful information and stories and reflections in that book. And so if you've just joined us, do look in the comments on YouTube or on this Facebook Live to see where you can access the book, either from St Andrew's Press directly or from Fresh Expressions and our shop on the FX Resourcing website. And just want to say thank you, Lesley. Thank you, David. Thank you for the time you put into reflecting and encouraging fresh expressions in the Church of Scotland, but also sort of reflecting and learning from that, so the rest of us can benefit. And Paul says, "Amen. Wonderful. Thank you." And as I say, thank you to you. Thank you for those of you that have watched today as well. Do catch some of our other videos, webinars. You can see a list of them on the fxresourcing.org website or on our Fresh Expressions YouTube channel, or by searching on our Facebook page. And see you again soon. Bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye.